Many of the folks on the U.S. left, they've tended to look benignly at 1776. In fact, my book that has been criticized most sharply is precisely The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Although every cloud has a silver lining, that's the book that's probably sold best because many people want to find out what the controversy is about. Hollywood focuses on organized crime because Hollywood is infested by organized crime. Just as in the music industry, you've had this phenomenon known as gangster rap, which has led to this allied phenomena. In ordinary lingo in the United States, gangsta has become a verb, an adjective. It does a lot of work. Shirley Graham Du Bois stays on in Ghana, becomes the director of television in Ghana. What she tries to do is install television monitors in villages in Africa, in classrooms, so that television could become a tool for mass education, as opposed to what it has become in the United States, at least, and perhaps elsewhere. That is to say, a tool for misinformation, a tool for mindless entertainment, where it is referred to colloquially as the boob tube. Now, perhaps some of you are wondering, okay, Professor Horn, we hear what you're saying, but here you are, you're sitting in Texas telling us all this. Why are you allowed to do this? Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure if I will be allowed to do this for much longer. But fortunately, I'm able to do so now. And so I will do so until the last breath escapes from my body.
So hi everyone, and welcome to this second episode of Amandla, your monthly internationalist program with historian and political activist Dr. Gerald Horn. My name is Malika from the Pan-African League Umoja. Before introducing our guests, I would like to welcome my co-hosts. We have Natasha from New York City and Buna of the Pan-African League Umoja joining us from Paris. So let me now turn to our guests. Dr. Horn is a historian and longtime political activist and in anti-racist, Pan-African, and working class struggles. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is the author of at least 50 books on a wide range of issues, including Black internationalism, the music and film industry, imperialism, class struggles, settlers, colonialism, white supremacies, and the resistance of enslaved Africans. His latest book includes Armed Struggles, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, and also African Americans and a New History of the USA. We would like to mention the fact that Dr. Gerald Horn wrote the foreword to a very important book that was published recently, named A Fighting Dream, The Political Writings of Claudia Jones. Trained as a lawyer, Gerald Horn has been at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle in the US in the 1980s as the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. Gerald Horn is also the co-producer and host of Freedom Now, a weekly Pan-African internationalist and anti-imperialist program, which airs on KPFK 19.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, and can be found at kpfk.org, that is kpfk.org, or on the YouTube channel of the Activist News Network. He is also a permanent guest of the three other important programs that were worth mentioning. The Horn Report on diasporic music, which airs on Black Power 96 radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time and replays on the Activist News Network. The second one is Around the Horn, a weekly internationalist news update on the Activist News Network. And the last one, De Facto Podcast with Anthony Ballas. Dr. Horn, as always, it's an honor and privilege to have you. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to your show on BPM.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
What do you, before we get started discussing all of the books today, Dr. Horn, do you have any comments to make about, what has recently transpired, all of the things that have recently transpired since January 20th?
Well, obviously, we're in the middle of a counter-revolutionary moment. It's quite dangerous for the people of the United States. It's quite dangerous for the international community because the erratic Mr. Trump is shifting U.S. imperialism strategy. We had thought that he was going to break with the Biden wing of the U.S. ruling class, which involved seeking to weaken Russia so as to better attack and undermine China by dint of this fiasco and escapade in Ukraine. We thought that Mr. Trump was going to try to cut a deal with Russia and then focus on China, and then, of course, loot the so-called allies, starting with Canada in the first instance, and then moving on to the European Union and Britain. He's already established or has talked about establishing an external revenue service so that billions from the allies, so-called, can pour into the Treasury in Washington. And this, of course, is upsetting the so-called allies, but, they help to bring this problem on themselves with being junior partners of U.S. imperialism and allowing U.S. imperialism to be the guarantor of world imperialism. Obviously, what has happened is that U.S. imperialism has found it difficult to subjugate altogether the countries of the global South. Look at the fiascos and debacles in Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq and other sites too numerous to mention. So now they say, oh, these allies, they have even more wealth and resources. I mean, Canada is the second largest country on planet Earth. It only has a population of about 40 million, mostly strung along the border with the United States of America. Canada is a mining superpower, not only in terms of exploitation of Africa, but on its own soil. And so it's a very lush target for the eagles in Washington, D.C. But what I've just said, notwithstanding, in the last day or two, Mr. Trump has been attacking Mr. Putin and attacking Russia. So this idea of cutting a deal with Russia, I'm not sure where it stands now. I mean, Trump is so erratic. It's hard
not
to
sure where he's going to go next.
It's hard to figure out. Or, the U.S. Supreme Court made this decision that says anything a president does in pursuing his duties can be adjudged to be constitutional and legal. And so perhaps some billionaire neoconservative gave his family $100 million to change his policy. That would be legal, and it would be totally consistent with the Trump brand, because going into his first week in office, he added to the plethora of conflicts of interest by entering the cryptocurrency market, which by issuing this coin. And he and Melania, in fact. And that's a real head scratcher, because we had thought that part of the attraction of crypto was that it allows you to do an end run around the so-called fiat currencies like the US dollar, and therefore, in a sense, presents a danger to the US dollar. In fact, I saw a documentary some months ago about the popularity of crypto amongst post-apartheid Europeans in South Africa, for example, because they feel it does an end run around the rand, the South African currency. And so when I read about that, and then I looked at his inauguration speech, and he talked about going to Mars, it reminded me of a movie I once saw, Elysium, which I recommend. It's not that good, but the concept is interesting, with Matt Damon and Jodie Foster. It's about how the wealthy, after they trash this planet, they decide to move to outer space. And it's quite a dystopia. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's the play. Trump is pursuing an exit strategy, so he and Elon Muscolini can flee to Mars after they trash this planet. Of course, that brings us to his initial actions of this week, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, which makes wildfires in Los Angeles more likely, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, which makes the damage from future pandemics even more likely. And of course, important to his base and to him personally is pardoning the criminals who tried to execute a fascist coup on January 6, 2021. With their pardon, the possibility is open, the door is open for them to constitute a kind of militia. Militia is not affiliated with the state, or at least not organically or umbilically, or quite notorious in U.S. history. You're probably familiar with the Ku Klux Klan, which from its inception in the post-1865 era was like the armed wing of the Democratic Party, not necessarily the army of the state. And so now, with releasing these criminals who now are saying, these are their words, not mine, that they're interested in retaliation and retribution, for example. So they're fired up. Recall that during his debate with Mr. Biden in the fall of 2020, he told them to stand by. That was his words, not mine. And so we're entering a very dangerous moment here in the United States of America. Also important to his base is the overthrow of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The erosion of affirmative action is going to make it more likely that unqualified Euro-American men in particular are hired over qualified Black people in general for federal jobs and presumably for other jobs, because tailing after Mr. Trump and overthrowing diversity, equity, inclusion, and affirmative action have been Meta, Facebook, have been a number of other corporations as well. So this is a very perilous moment, and sadly, I'm not sure if the Black community is prepared nor ready for what's about to hit this Category 5 political hurricane.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we don't have a choice, right? And those of us who've been working and trying to get the people to understand what's going on, can glean a lot from this situation and look for the opportunities, like I think we mentioned before, in the cracks for us to, make headway, and discussions like this and the kind of information that your books bring forth are really important in times like this, but have always been important as well as into the future. So we wanted to start today's discussion focusing on your book that you wrote about 20 years ago in 2007, titled The Deepest South. I'll just put it up here so that everyone can kind of see. And so The Deepest South, the United States, Brazil, and the African slave trade. And so, Dr. Horn, we wanted to start off with an intriguing question, but also with a even more intriguing anecdote that is in the epilogue of The Deepest South, which deals with the perception of Brazil among U.S. elites. And so, reportedly, the quote goes, and I'll just also share that with the people as well. So the quote says that reportedly in a 2002 meeting between U.S. President George W. Bush and then Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the former asked, "Do you have blacks too?" Bush's aide, Condoleezza Rice, who happened to be of African descent, noticing how astonished the Brazilian was, saved the day by telling Mr. Bush that, Mr. President, Brazil probably has more blacks than the USA. Some say it's a country with the most Blacks outside of Africa. The widespread circulation of this story in Brazil may suggest lingering feelings there about how U.S. nationals transformed the demographic makeup of this South American colossus by the dint of illicit African slave trade. So our first question to you is, we wanted to ask, if the amnesia, or if we could put it bluntly, the ignorance displayed by people like George W. Bush regarding the scope of the slave trade and the deep involvement of the U.S. Nationals in crimes against humanity, the main trigger of the research that led to was the main trigger of the research that led to the publication of your book on Brazil, and also the gaps in academia, if there were any, that you sought to fill in doing this book?
Well, thank you for that question. Thinking about this book brings back memories, I must confess. As you said, I wrote this book some years ago. It involved not only research in the United States, but research naturally in Brazil, and also research in Portugal. And just as a footnote for future scholars, that in terms of the European archives with monumental detail and information about people of African descent, of course, there's London and Paris, but do not sleep on Lisbon. As a matter of fact, I still recall when I was doing research in Portugal, running across files that the Portuguese secret police had kept on the activist known as Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture. And of course, that was out of my lane. I've told people about it. I'm telling you about it. But what I found is that, like the British, the Portuguese kept significant records about their depredations because they never thought that they would be brought to justice. And so that's why they kept these meticulous records. But in any case, this book, among other things, it's meant to puncture the myth of the United States of America. The myth being, as the opening comment suggested, that there was this great leap forward in 1776 with the creation of the United States of America. And yet, you might be able to say that it was a great leap forward for those who could be defined as, quote, white, unquote. That is to say, not only those who had been warring on the shores of Britain, that is English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, and then British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat. The list is endless. Even Christians from West Asia, Lebanon, for example, like Ralph Nader, the former presidential candidate, he's defined as white. You have a TV show host, quite popular, who was making $20 million a year, Egyptian Coptic, here in the United States of America. So certainly, for those who have been defined as white, this creation of the United States is, for many, and it's certainly not all, it's been an El Dorado. I mean, it's quite astonishing. I think that's part of the problem now, because it's clear that the days of El Dorado in North America are disappearing in the rearview mirror. And of course, some of you may be old enough to recall the crooner of yore, Keith Sweat. Yes. And his signature hit, "Make it last forever." Well, that's the theme of the Trump base. Make it last forever. But alas, it will not last forever. And we can already begin to see the outlines of its demise. In any case, by the 1790s, U.S. nationals were in control of the slave trade to Cuba, for example. I interviewed a scholar at UC Irvine. You can find him on the Activist News Network, who's doing research on the U.S. role in the slave trade to the Rio de la Plata, Uruguay, and Argentina, for example. Argentina, as you may know, at one time had a substantial population of African descent. Bequeathed to us the tango, amongst other cultural contributions. And so my book deals with the role of U.S. nationals in the slave trade to Brazil, which accelerates in the 1830s and the 1840s, particularly plundering Angola, Congo, and Mozambique. You may know that Zanzibar, now part of Tanzania, off the southeastern coast of Africa, at one time was like the Walmart of the African slave trade. That is to say that Africans were brought from the interior of Africa to Zanzibar, brought from surrounding archipelagos and islands, such as Madagascar, for example. Réunion, where of course, France still exercises colonial control. Mayotte, which, as you know, was the site of a recent natural disaster, for example. And by the 1830s and 1840s, the major economic force in Zanzibar, where all these Africans were ingathering, were US nationals. And of course, needless to say, not only were they dragging Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to Brazil, but many of them made their way to the United States of America. In fact, there's a vignette in the book we're now discussing about how a Black youth was dragged across the Atlantic from Africa and then somehow found his way into the family of a US diplomat. And they all moved to Maine in the United States of America. And they became sort of the first family, Black style, of Maine, for example. Their descendants continue to reside in Maine. And so this is scandalous. And what's even more scandalous, perhaps, is the fact that by the 1840s, you had the US envoy in Brazil, Henry Wise, a name that might be familiar to some of you, recalled that as governor of Virginia in 1859, he presided over the execution of John Brown, who, with his hardy band, had sought to lead an armed uprising against slavery, but for their troubles, they were captured, tried, and executed. Although, as I talk about in my book to be published in the fall, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, one of the Black comrades escaped and wound up writing a memoir that I quote from. As a matter of fact, I start the book by talking about how this Black comrade gets the drop on a descendant of George Washington, who was a slave owner in Virginia, what was then Virginia, now West Virginia. And this descendant of George Washington began crying like a baby, crying for his life, because he thought that he was about to meet his maker. But in any case, Henry Wise, obviously pro-slavery, as a minister of Brazil in the 1840s, he wanted to see a curtailment of the African slave trade to Brazil, masterminded by US nationals. And I know that some of you are probably scratching your heads and trying to figure that out. Well, the conundrum can be answered easily. This is sardonic laughter, because what I'm talking about is obviously not humorous at all. As I also talk about in this book, upcoming in the fall, Virginia and Maryland, in the latter stages of slavery, had become breeding grounds for breeding Africans, like you breed bulls or racehorses, and then exporting them. So he wanted the Africans to be bred in Virginia and Maryland and then shipped en masse to Brazil, as opposed to going into Africa, because he thought that would be more efficient, probably more profitable, certainly to people in Virginia and Maryland, for example. And excuse my bringing to your attention the grimy details of this, but as the saying goes, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. Fundamentally, what would happen is that a slave owner in Virginia and or Maryland would summon a Shaquille O'Neal type figure and demand that he mate with a Beyonce type figure on the premise that this would produce some sort of enslaved African that could be sold for a pretty penny. And so this was the idea of Henry Wise, the de facto ambassador of the United States to Brazil. I should also say, and this is something that has not been forgotten in Brazil, there was this idea in the United States of annexing Brazil. As you probably know, Brazil is larger or as large in territory as the lower 48. That is to say, the United States absent Alaska, for example, and perhaps absent Hawaii. And the idea was, as concocted by a man who's considered to be the father of oceanography. I'm speaking of Matthew Fontaine Maury, M-A-U-R-Y. You find his name scattered all over the landscape here in the United States of America, even though he was a notorious enslaver. In fact, he figures in my book on Texas, because after the enslavers were defeated, Matthew Fontaine Maury and other enslavers, they went to move to Mexico because the French had seized Mexico during the time of the U.S. Civil War. And they were willing to cooperate with the enslavers in establishing a slave citadel in Mexico. But what happens is that the patriotic Mexicans rise up, help to capture and execute Emperor Maximilian, the European who had been put on the throne in Mexico. In fact, he's executed on June 19th, 1867. And I've maintained that that's really the true Juneteenth, because as you know, we have this holiday, June 19th, 1865, when supposedly the Negroes in Texas found out that they were actually free. I mean, it's such mythology. But the real June 19th is June 19th, 1867, because until that point, the idea was still alive that slavery could continue south of the border. But in any case, Matthew Fontaine Maury had this idea based upon studying currents of oceans and rivers, that the Amazon, which is comparable to the Nile and the Mississippi River in terms of being a major artery, somehow it had currents that connected it umbilically to the United States of America, which meant that the United States should take over Brazil. The Amazon, of course, is the major river of Brazil, not just a rapacious corporation that plunders its workers and consumers alike in 2025 under the misleadership of Jeff Bezos, who also happens to be the owner of the Washington Post newspaper. But that particular harebrained scheme obviously did not take flight, although, as we also know, in reference here, what I just said about the enslavers moving to Mexico, even more after they were defeated, moved to Brazil, where their descendants continued to reside. In fact, they took some of their valuable property, speaking of enslaved Africans, with them, which raises the tantalizing possibility that there are those of us in North America who have relatives in Brazil unbeknownst to us. And in another book, as I continue my tracking down and unmasking the depredations of these exploiters, in my book, The White Pacific, I talk about how after the U.S. Civil War, they also go to the South Seas and begin to try to enslave Melanesians. Melanesians look like yourselves and myself. They heavily populate Papua New Guinea, also heavily populate Irian Jaya, which is now a part of Indonesia. There's a conflict going on there. And I'm writing this book right now as we speak, the counter-revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup, and the roots of U.S. imperialism in Asia and Pacific. It'll be out next year. And I just wrote a paragraph about how the Dutch, when they were controlling Indonesia, they would try to bring Africans from their colonies in the Americas, like Suriname, or St. Martin, for example, these small islands, to act as police in Indonesia so that they could stir up conflict between the darker skinned, so-called woolly haired folks in Irian Jaya and the other folks in Indonesia who are browner skinned and have straightened hair, for example. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest, once again, that certain Euro-Americans wanted to get in on the action. And so needless to say, they brought U.S. Negroes across the Pacific to Indonesia as well to try to get in on the action. Just in terms of analyzing myself, I think I'm chuckling to try to distance myself from the horrors of what I'm describing. So please excuse me. But in any case, as I talk about it in this other book on the White Pacific, the Hawaiian monarchy, which was very sophisticated. It had envoys in about 100 different countries, ambassadors, for example. Some of the records in Honolulu are just amazing. And they also try to establish a relationship with a rising Japan. To this very day, the plurality of the population in Hawaii are of Japanese ancestry. But then that leads to the Hawaii coup, the establishment of apartheid in Hawaii, and of course, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese military bombs Pearl Harbor. The reasons, even to this very day, is somehow unbeknownst to many in the United States of America, unaware of this history I've just sketched, for example. So the story of Brazil is part of a larger story about how these U.S. nationals were becoming the masterminds of exploiting Black people. As a matter of fact, I would make the argument that when U.S. slavery was at its apex before 1865, no Black person anywhere in the world was safe. Because what would happen is that you would have U.S. vessels who would, say, maybe sail into France and sail into a coastal port, say Marseille, for example, and they'd see a Black person walking along the dock, and they grab him, put him on a boat. Next thing you know, he's picking cotton in Mississippi, for example. It's really scandalous, and I think that there's a connection between how we opened this program talking about the depredations of Mr. Trump with a 77 million strong base, which some of our friends on the left are trying to convince us that the 77 million strong, they're actually sort of frustrated social democrats. Don't buy it. Don't believe the hype. They know what they're getting. They want a replay of the bad old days. And it's our job, of course, to prevent that from happening. And there's a connection between what we talked about in the beginning and these depredations that we're talking about that are taking place in Brazil in the 19th century.
Thank you so much. Me and Gerald Horn are both, in the same place. We're both wiping our noses and trying to deal with this season of whatever goes around at this time. But thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Horn. And I think especially like you're saying, us trying to deal with this current time of them trying to do a replay, and also makes me think about, right, the abolishment of enslavement, and in particular, thinking about the abolishment of enslavement in Brazil in 1888. Mm-hmm. And making the South American, which once that happened, we know that Brazil, as the South American giant that it is, was the last country in the hemisphere to actually abolish slavery. 2 years later, after Cuba. And so where you have U.S. nationals who were, like you were mentioning, that were heavily involved in the enslavement of Africans there, as you mentioned in, responding to the first question, which is a topic that you also covered, how the U.S. nationals were involved in the enslavement of people of African descent in Cuba through your book that's called Race to Revolution. U.S.,
Mhm.
Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow. And one
Mhm.
of the reasons why the abolition of slavery in Brazil came so late was because um, it was extremely profitable, especially
Mhm.
U.S. nationals. And so I wanted to read a quote from your book where it says that this Brazilian slave trade as a whole was more profitable than that of any other national slave trade. It was a variable El Dorado. During the pivotal 1840s, there were probably more slaves traded at the Valango market in Rio de Janeiro than all of New Orleans markets put together. Yet the importance of this African slave trade to Brazil has not been sufficiently recognized in the nation, and that was one of the principal beneficiaries. And that was one of its principal beneficiaries, the U.S., and not least the historical amnesia elides the profound point that this odious commerce constituted a sort of unsuspected and very often deliberately concealed genocide, contributing to the sad fact that the African population declined significantly as a portion of the world's population between 1700 and 1900, a decline that can be attributed to, in large part, to the effects of slavery and the slave trade. This occurred simultaneously. Much of the wealth, as simultaneously as much of the wealth of the major nations of Europe and North America was built on the labor and suffering of millions of Africans. And so, to this point, into this quote, can you explain how the lasting impact of the Atlantic slave trade continues to shape the social and economic fate of Africans on the mother continent and in the diaspora? And we're asking this because one of the tricks used by imperialists and colonialists, as we know, is to impose this type of amnesia of forgetting. And I think James Baldwin has a really good quote about, to be an American is to forget, that you mentioned, and also blame Africans and African descended people for their own problems, while in the same way that they try to say, well, slavery happened because we sold ourselves into slavery, while completely overshadowing the horrendous crimes that they have inflicted on Africans. So can you explain to us a little bit about the lasting impact of the slave trade and how it continues to shape the social and economic fate of Africans on the continent and the diaspora?
Well, fortunately, we have with us the work of the late great Walter Rodney and how Europe underdeveloped Africa, which goes into the point that you just referenced in some detail. Likewise, when you were making that latter point about seeking to blame the victims, which is part of the national sport of the United States of America, it reminds me of a point that I make in a long footnote in the book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, now reprinted in the latest book, African Americans in a New History of the United States of America. It's a very tricky point, so stay with me. The rulers of the United States have exhibited special animosity, perhaps not surprisingly, towards the descendants of enslaved Africans in North America, which is not to say that they have given a pass to other Black people. It's just that they have a special hatred for my ancestors, who, of course, were enslaved in Mississippi. You may recall the cut by the late, great Nina Simone, Mississippi Got Down, which sums up pithily the plight of Black people in the Magnolia State. And I think this is a very important point to grasp, because you have this Black neoconservative scholar who is very influential, Thomas Sowell, Sowell. He's made a career of writing a book about the same topic over and over again. What is that topic? I say, why are you Negroes complaining? I mean, you have these South Asians, they come to the United States, they become the head of Alphabet, Google, and Microsoft. And obviously there's something wrong with you people because of your inability to rise like even other Black immigrant groups have risen. But as I said, that elides the point of this special hatred. And I think it's understandable, because when slavery was abolished in North America, unlike Haiti, where an indemnity, that is to say reparations, was paid to the enslavers, which crippled and deformed the Haitian economy from the time the check was cut. Well, actually it was cut repeatedly, but beginning to be cut in the 1820s going forward. Or when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s. There's evidence to suggest that as recently as 10 years ago, the descendants of enslavers were still being paid off by London, for example. But when slavery was abolished in the United States, nothing, except in Washington, D.C., which will be a point that I'll reference in this upcoming book. The enslavers in Washington, D.C. were compensated, but otherwise they weren't. And oftentimes when I am making this point in a classroom, you know, our classes today, even though I haven't taught in 5 years, but from 5 years ago, students are fiddling with their smartphones as you're talking, you know, I guess, you know, watching Rihanna videos and checking basketball scores, etc. And so I'll swoop down and grab their smartphone and say, I've just expropriated your private property without compensation. That's what happened to the enslavers in the South. Now, you're very angry, aren't you? Because you don't think I'll give the smartphone back. As a matter of fact, you're ready to break with protocol and take me outside and give me a good thrashing. Well, basically, that's what happened in the South. And so, given the fury of these enslavers after their property was seized without compensation, you can begin to understand the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. You can begin to understand the despising of Black people, particularly the descendants of enslaved Africans in Dixie, because when their property was taken, many of them were plunged into poverty, for example. After, as you probably know, in 1860, on the verge of the U.S. Civil War, the investment in the bodies of enslaved Africans was the most lucrative investment in all of the United States of America, for example. Indeed, as I'm going to talk about in this book on the Asia Pacific, the abolition of slavery in many ways is a conditioned precedent for the acceleration of U.S. imperialism, because what happens is that instead of capital being poured into the bodies of enslaved Africans, there is another outlet for capital. For example, in Hawaii, for example, U.S. nationals were a major force in Borneo, in the South Seas, as early as the 1860s, where you have a number of Melanesians, for example. And so when slavery was abolished in Brazil, of course, you had similar outrage, because, as noted, you had many U.S. nationals who brought their enslaved Africans with them from North America post 1865. And then these enslaved Africans were freed. It was something that was bound to generate outrage.
Yes, I actually do agree with everything that you're saying. I think that there is this collective idea in this specific demographic following Trump that the victims of slavery should be grateful for the freedom given by the master, but instead they're being angry and taking everything from them. And is what we're seeing now today. But I would like to turn to the impact of the Haitian Revolution and jump to that. Dr. Horn, in many of your books, including Confronting the Black Jacobin, you've argued that the glorious Haitian Revolution created a general crisis of the slave system that could only be resolved by its crisis. And in your book, The Deepest South, you wrote, and I quote, Certainly, there was hemispheric apprehension about the potential reach of Haiti's abolitionism, not least in those nations within Spain's sphere of influence, just as the planters of Kingston were forced to consider the implications of slave unrest in Puerto Rico, and Venezuela's move towards abolition was influenced profoundly by Port-au-Prince. Madrid's representative in Washington kept a close eye on abolitionism in the US, wary of its implications for Cuba and Puerto Rico, just as it mentioned carefully developments in Haiti, constantly sensitive to the implications of race and slavery. Though the number of Africans in Argentina was considerably less than that of Brazil, there too close attention was paid to developments in Haiti and slavery in the US. And just as they were imagining in the US about shipping certain Africans en masse to Liberia, similar ideas had arisen at the same time in Brazil. So, could you explain how the Haitian Revolution forced the enslavers, inu- indul- inuding those from the US to rethink their strategies, and how it has influenced the legal and illegal slave trade in Brazil?
So there's so many ideas that are flowing through my head. I'm not really sure where to start. I mean, first of all, with the Haitian Revolution succeeding in 1804, and by the way, on Freedom Now, eventually to be posted on the Activist News Network, I just conducted an interview with Marlene Doubt, D-A-U-T, who just wrote this book, The Last King of Haiti, about Henri Christophe, one of the post-1804 leaders of Haiti. Tomorrow, I'm taping an interview with Julie Gaffield, whose book, biography of Dessalines, a close comrade of Christophe and Toussaint, will be published in a few weeks. So I'm happy to say that the uncovering of truths about Haiti proceeds apace. So what happens with the Haitian Revolution, if you look at your map, you'll see the proximity of Haiti to Jamaica. And London had reason to fear that Haiti would intervene in the internal affairs of this fabulously wealthy so-called sugar colony. You may recall that the man given credit for lighting the match, literally and figuratively, that started the fires in Haiti in August 1791, was a man of Jamaican ancestry, for example. And so London rapidly came to the conclusion that the jig was up. And by 1807, it had moved to circumscribe the role of British nationals in the African slave trade. By 1834, it abolished slavery, once again compensating the enslavers, not compensating the enslaved. And this was largely due to pressure from the Haitians. The Haitians had developed a navy which was seeking to block slave ships from arriving in the neighborhood, particularly in Cuba, where, as you suggested, slavery continued up until the late 1880s. And it began to collaborate, speaking of the Haitian revolutionaries, with British abolitionists, because in the British ruling class, after they were forced to abolish slavery, they thought it would be dirty pool to allow their peers and competitors to continue with this odious commerce. And then, of course, they had this active abolitionist movement at the same time. And so you begin to see the Britons and the Haitians putting pressure on the United States of America, for example. Indeed, and I think it's in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, there's a chapter entitled, Will Haiti and Britain Establish a Free Black State in Texas? That is to say, Texas had seceded from Mexico in 1836, established an independent republic, and the Lone Star flag could be found off the coast of Brazil, Angola. They were competing with the United States, actually, for leadership of the African slave trade. But they needed backup because they were not strong enough to compete with London and Haiti. And so they joined the United States in 1845 because they basically had no choice because of the pressure being exerted on them by Haiti and Britain. Although, of course, of late, the ultra-right wing in Texas is talking about seceding from the United States of America because they see a new day has emerged. And if that happens, Katie bar the door, as they say in this country, because if you think what happened in the United States was wild this past week, it'll seem tame by comparison if Texas becomes an independent state. I should also mention for the younger scholars who may be viewing this conversation that there are about 90 thick volumes, printed volumes, published by Irish University Press in Shannon, Ireland, that documents the role of abolitionism, including treaties between Britain and Haiti with regard to circumscribing the African slave trade, for example. I've used those volumes repeatedly. As a matter of fact, I think I even used them in this book on Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. I've used them for a number of different books. They're quite a valuable resource. And since they're books, you don't have to travel to an archive. You can just request them into Library Loan, and they'll be deposited at your neighborhood library in France or in New York or in Monaco. Although, of course, if you're in New York, they're probably at the New York Public Library in any case. So I'll stop there because I know we don't have much time left, and I want to give each and every one of you an opportunity to address these issues.
Yes, no worries. Your insights are always very valuable. So I'm just thinking, in one of his most famous speeches, if not the most famous, The Ballot and the Bullets from Malcolm X, he said, and I quote, "If you're black, you were born in jail, in the North as well as in the South. Stop talking about the South. As long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South." And when one looks at the profiles of those who were involved in the slave trade to Brazil, you get an illustration of what Malcolm X was describing. So in your book, you wrote that, and I quote, "The late 1850s marked a zenith of the illicit slave trade, and the profits to be gained flowed into the pockets of men on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, particularly those in New York and New Orleans. But as London pushed the trade out of Brazilian waters, it simply moved further north to the doorstep of the US itself, and thus, ironically, the actual rise of the commerce actually marked its death knell as the apparent successes of fire eaters from Dixie helped to push the nation into a bloody conflict." So how do you account for the fact that the North, which was theoretically abolitionist, had so many of its inhabitants deeply immersed in the enslaved Africans in Brazil?
Well, first of all, if you look at the slave ships, they're oftentimes constructed in Maine, for example. Maine still may have shipyards. I was just reading a story the other day that suggested that China's ability to build vessels is 230 times the size of that of the United States of America. Now, how that happened would require a lengthy digression that I won't enter into. But I will say that at one time, Maine was a major shipbuilding site, and then many of the vessels, the slave trading vessels, were constructed in Maine. So Maine is far distant from Dixie, far distant from the African slave trade. And then there are the banks, which are disproportionately headquartered in New York City, providing credit to enslavers who would borrow money in order to pay their crews, for example, which means that New York was complicit in the slave trade. And as a matter of fact, more than 80 years ago, the late prolific historian Philip Foner, one of his first books was entitled The Business of Slavery, still worth reading. It deals with the slave trade in New York City, for example. And so there is something to that quotation from Malcolm that you read, that you read. The Hartford Courant, Courant, the major newspaper in the largest city in Connecticut, did a series a few years ago about how Connecticut, far distant from Dixie, was deeply implicated in the slave trade. And not only the fact that the sons and daughters of the elite, oftentimes of the Southern elite, were oftentimes educated at Yale University in Connecticut. I'm speaking of John C. Calhoun, who was probably the ideological and theoretical master of enslavement. Roots in South Carolina, educated at Yale, in Connecticut. Until recently, there were edifices at Yale that were named after this notorious enslaver until protests erupted, for example. So you were correct to suggest that there was an organic connection between North and South. I should also mention West, because after the United States seizes California from Mexico in a war of aggression concluding in 1848, the small town that was then Los Angeles became a hotbed of enslavers, for example. Indeed, there was a possibility during the US Civil War that California could join the Confederacy because there was such pro-Confederate sentiment in the Golden State. So, I mean, these are just fundamental lessons that we need to absorb.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. We did have a question on Henry Wise and Matthew Fontaine Maury. Actually, you do dedicate 2 separate chapters on those 2 historic characters who ironically were against slave trade but pro-slavery. But I think you've already covered their involvement including in the attempt to capture the Amazon. So I will skip that. But I did wanted to talk about and you've kind of hinted to the question that I'm going to ask now, which is about the U.S. Southerners, okay, the rebel migrants who actually fled the South after the Civil War, after they were defeated in the Civil War and settled in Brazil, right? So those immigrants were hoping to find a white paradise, okay, which is an expression that you use in the book, where they would be allowed to continue enslaving Africans. But things did not turn out as they expected, right? As many of those real migrants ended up disillusioned and disenchanted in the deeper South. So in the book, you write that, and I'm quoting you, soon the inevitable occurred. Disgusted with the underdevelopment of Brazil compared to the US, upset with the state of race relations, unable to communicate in an alien tongue, bothered by the often less than friendly attitudes of the locals, and often bordering on misery, a growing number of rebel migrants swallowed their corrosive doubts about the US and returned to their homeland. So in the aforementioned speech that Malika has referred to by Malcolm X, The Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm X also suggested that the South did not lose the war, right? The Civil War. And the reason why he said that is because the defeat of Reconstruction has been a significant setback for formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants. So I would like to ask you if you think that it would be fair to say that despite the disillusionment and the disenchantment of the Southerners whose bitter experience in Brazil you describe in the book, would it be fair to say that they did end up being victorious, quote unquote, despite their defeat in the Civil War, or at least victorious until the collapse of Jim Crow?
Well, to a degree, yes, because obviously these miscreants, they should have been put on trial. I mean, perhaps subjected to execution, for example. The fact that that didn't happen is a victory for them, no doubt. But let me elaborate upon that quote from my book, because I think it's illustrative. So Portugal is a country with a contemporary population of about 9 million. Brazil is a country with a contemporary population of over 200 million. So the disparity in those numbers also helps to shed light on why Euro-Americans were able to play such a pivotal and instrumental role. And in fact, I think I said this in my book on Kenya, because some of the earliest so-called British settlers in Nairobi were actually Euro-Americans, and some of the wealthiest, because Britain has a contemporary population of about, 60, 65 million, and then they had this empire sprawling all over the world. And the United States, by dint of elasticizing this category of race, they're incorporating Serbs and Croats and Germans and Russians. They have this large population. The United States has a population of 330 million right now. And so these colonizing powers oftentimes found it necessary to rely upon Euro-Americans, many of whom got wealthy, I might say, at the expense of the British Empire and perhaps at the expense of the Portuguese Empire as well. Now, because of that disparity, Portugal having a contemporary population of 9 million, perhaps in the 19th century, let's say the population is 4 or 5 million, that may be an overestimate. And so so-called race relations proceeded differently than the United States. The United States, because they had this large so-called white population, since they were recruiting all over Europe, recruiting in Lebanon, as I said, Coptic Christians in Egypt. And so there developed this so-called one-drop rule. I mean, you could look like George W. Bush, but if it could be said that you have the faintest hint of African ancestry, that means you're black, and you could be subjected to slavery. Portugal was not able to go in that direction. And so what happens is that the folks we would call lighter-skinned Negroes played an instrumental role in Portuguese slave society. Now, to be sure, in certain southern cities like Charleston, South Carolina, and Natchez, Mississippi, you had a similar phenomenon, but not to the same degree. I mean, you had people we would call black slave owners in Charleston and in Natchez. But it was much more developed in Brazil because of those disparities in terms of the relatively small Portuguese population. But then you have these Euro-Americans from Dixie flooding into Brazil in 1865. They're used to seeing what they would call light-skinned Negroes and feeling they can slap them across the face, kick them in the butt whenever they were ready. But they didn't realize they were part of the exploiting class, for example. And that was very difficult. That was a very difficult adjustment for these Euro-Americans to make. And that's one of the reasons they call Brazil underdeveloped, for example. You know that in today's Brazil, there's this saying, I'm not sure if it's true, but it's illustrative, that folks in Alaska have about 20 different words for snow, for example. So, which illustrates how heavily the weather and snow weighs on their consciousness. Actually, it might be more than that. And so in Brazil, you have all of these different so-called racial categories. In the United States, of course, it's rather simple. I mean, the light-skinned Negroes are black, full stop, because of the evolution I've just described. Whereas in Brazil, you have all of these gradations in between, with rights and responsibilities doled out on melanin content. This was a very difficult adjustment for many of these Euro-Americans to make. And then there's the language. You know how chauvinistic today these people in the United States. I even had a friend of mine said that when he was in Sweden, he forced people to speak English. You know, I don't know how that happens. I mean, they don't know English. I mean, how are you going to force them? Anyway, but it illustrates a certain kind of chauvinism. For example, you go to somebody's country and you expect them to speak to you in your tongue, not in their tongue. And then you get upset if they don't. And as my friend said, you force them to speak English. I don't know. What are they put a computer chip in their brain, and I've seen these devices which are actually on the market now, quite nifty, where you speak in English into the device and then it translates. But he wasn't talking about this because this is before the invention of these devices. So I say all that to say that there were these enormous cultural adjustments that these Euro-Americans had to make. Although having said that, many of them still reside in Brazil. As a matter of fact, as I was talking, I was sort of stalling because I was trying to recover from my memory bank. Perhaps you all know the name of the Brazilian airplane manufacturer. Actually, I probably should just do a quick search, which is popular all over the world. And it was started by these Euro-American Southerners, for example. As a matter of fact, I did a book for Black Classic Press, which is a Black-owned publisher, called Storming the Heavens. It's about Black Americans in flight. And in that book, I bring forth the controversy that the airplane, which we're quite familiar with, was not developed by Orville and Wilbur Wright in Dayton, Ohio, but was developed by these Brazilians, for example, prior, and which of course illustrates the point that if you have a good invention, you should have a good lawyer to go to the patent office so that your invention can be protected. But in any case, there were multiple and manifold difficulties that these exiles had, which is one of the reasons why so many of them returned to the United States, particularly after 1888, when slavery was abolished. Many of them, they weren't compensated. I mean, they're like the people in the United States. So here they are in this country where people they consider to be Black are not necessarily Black in the United States. They can't kick them around. They can't slap them in the face whenever they feel like it. And so they said, I'm going back to Mississippi. This place is bonkers.
Thanks for that, Dr. Horn. Malika?
Go ahead, Buna.
Yeah, so we did have a final question on internationalism, because this is something that you mentioned in the book, the importance of taking into account the dynamics in the hemispheric sphere. So we wanted to know how it could apply to the struggle of the Black internationalists, or at least those who want to perpetuate the legacy of Black internationalism. So how we can learn the lessons that you know in the books to further the interests and the cause of Africans and people of African descent worldwide. So in the book you wrote that those who, and I'm quoting, those who profited from slavery and the slave trade were aware that the existence of this system was not wholly dependent upon domestic events or occurrences in one nation, just as the late 20th century apartheid rulers realized that the continuation of their system was not unconnected to the fate of Jim Crow. In a similar fashion, the fate of slavery in the hemisphere was heavily dependent on the destiny of this institution in the slave South and Brazil. Mm-hmm. Actually, even those who abjured slavery and the slave trade too had to contend with the stiff competition provided by a nation that deployed laborers who received no wages. Mm-hmm. So, as people who aspire to perpetuate the legacy of Black internationalists, such as the late great Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, all these figures are obviously figures that you wrote books about. So I would like to ask you what kind of lessons that internationalists, would-be internationalists, can draw from what the quote that I just mentioned, and also how we can use internationalism to further the interests of Africans in the diaspora in the continent, both in the defensive and offensive manner. I know it's a broad question.
No. It's all good. As a matter of fact, can you bring that quote back? Because I want to refer to it. Good, thank you. You'll be happy to know that I continue to agree with that quote. I'm not going to reject it. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to brought back is because in this book, new book that you so kindly mentioned, African Americans and a New History of the United States, one of the themes of that book refers to this latter sentence. That is to say, settler colonialism in North America. Oh, gee, you folks are ready. Okay. Settler colonialism in North America was based on class collaboration between and amongst the Europeans, because they felt that they all could benefit from looting and plundering the indigenous, taking their land, liquidating them, and then with luck and pluck, they'd be able to get Africans to work for free. And you still see class collaborationism this past week with Mr. Trump. We saw November 5th, 2024. I mean, you know, there's this aphorism about the 1%, that's to say the ruling elite. Well, the United States has a population of 330 million. It would be mathematically imprecise to suggest that only the 1% voted for Mr. Trump. The numbers don't add up. That is to say, he has a base in the Euro-American working class and Euro-American middle class. And just as I talked about black slave owners in Charleston and Natchez pre-1865, there is a sliver of black support for the Trump team, although overwhelmingly there is not. And this contradiction between class collaboration amongst the settlers and class struggle amongst the unpaid sector of the working class is a theme of that book, African Americans and a New History of the United States of America. And that's one of the reasons, one of the many, there's so many reasons why we've been treated so atrociously, but that's yet another reason, which is that many of us and many of our ancestors decided not to turn their back on struggle. I mean, if you've been forced to work for free, well, of course you're going to resist. You're going to malinger. You're going to break tools. You may set the plantation house on fire. You may ground up glass and feed it to the enslavers. I mean, it just stands to reason. And that's yet another reason to be exploited and oppressed. Now, with regard to your question, your intelligent question, obviously, if you look at Black people in North America, 13% of a population of 330 million, with 77 million voting for Mr. Trump, willingly and knowingly, in my opinion, obviously we need to lengthen the battlefield. And that, of course, has been how we've been able to survive to this point. The Haitian Revolution, our solidarity with Haiti, many of our ancestors actually moving to Haiti and moving to what is now the Dominican Republic. The alliances with Mexico. In my book on Texas, I talk about Vicente Guerrero, a man of African descent who abolishes slavery in Mexico. And then that leads to a stream of Black people moving to Mexico, which continues. I'm going to the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles, PAFF.org. Check out their lineup. And one of the films I plan to see is called Afro-Mexpats, as opposed to Afro-Expats, expatriates, because there is historically not only a large Black population in Veracruz, but then this expat community from Texas in particular, fleeing south of the border into Mexico. That continues with the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, with Jack Johnson, the great heavyweight champion born in Galveston, fleeing the clutches of the law in the United States, setting up a citadel, anti-Jim Crow citadel in Mexico, in the midst of flux, attracting Black Americans across the border to Mexico. The Bolshevik Revolution, for example, we're all familiar with the support for African liberation movements. I talked about this in our broadcasts, telecasts, YouTube cast on the Activist News Network just the other day, talking about how I had met a founder of Frelimo, the liberation movement in Mozambique, Marcelino dos Santos, in Moscow some decades ago. And this was in the context of talking about the foul assassination of the West African leader Amilcar Cabral by the Portuguese secret police in January 1973, for example. All of these liberation movements supported by the then Soviet Union. Then, of course, the retreat of Jim Crow having a lot to do with the fact that U.S. imperialism found it difficult to win hearts and minds in emerging Africa and the Caribbean as long as people of African descent in this country were treated so atrociously. That creates a dynamic that leads to the retreat of Jim Crow. But alas, the price of the ticket is throwing overboard the man you mentioned, Paul Robeson and others of his ilk, which has left our community bereft, flying blind, as I put it, which is something you should avoid. So certainly, if we're to beat back the Trump attack, we're going to have to revisit the lessons of the past. Foremost amongst those lessons is the deft application of Black internationalism, particularly since the correlation of forces domestically are so adverse. I was struck by the fact that just recently, Jean Chrétien, the 91-year-old former Prime Minister of Canada, in talking about beating back the Trump attack, instinctively, he says, well, we need to seek allies in Denmark, we need to seek allies in Panama, these other nations that are threatened by U.S. imperialism. In other words, Canada, a nation of 40 million, a nation that's part of the so-called Group of Seven, which styles itself as the coordinating committee for imperialism, if not planet Earth, Canada feels it needs internationalism, even though they have state power, they have a military, and yet some of our Black brothers and sisters don't necessarily have the same urgency, which is quite unfortunate, but I'm confident that that barrier will be overcome.
Absolutely. And I'm also I'm in 100% agreement with you, Dr. Horn, that barrier will be overcome, especially as we think about the lessons, like you were mentioning, recapturing those lessons from the past through the research and the scholarship that you've done, and through these books that we discuss. And within these books, there are so much of the lessons that we need to reclaim in order for us to overcome these barriers that we will, and strengthen the battlefield, as well as expand the battlefield, as you say, and become internationalists again. And I think we're headed that way. And the more we learn and the more we have these kinds of conversations, the closer we get, and the more our actions will be more aligned with internationalism and seeking class collaboration across classes, but also across continents. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Horn. And this has been Amandla, our second episode. We look forward to seeing you again for our third episode. And before we go, Dr. Horn has something to say.
Well, you are correct when you say the name of the Brazilian company is Embraer. This is the aircraft company whose name I could not recall, which is a major player. I'm sure each and every one of us have flown on an Embraer plane at one time or another. And the executive team has been heavily dominated by these Euro-Americans from Dixie who fled to Brazil after slavery was abolished in 1865.
Thank you for adding that point of clarification. So we always make sure we give you all the details so you can go and look it up and continue the research and continue to look into what we talk about here on the show. So once again, thank you, Dr. Horn. Thank you, Malika, as well as Buna, my co-host, for being here today and being here with us. Any last words?
No, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Horn.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed day.
Many of the folks on the U.S. left, they've tended to look benignly at 1776. In fact, my book that has been criticized most sharply is precisely The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Although Every Cloud Has a Silver Lining, that's the book that's probably sold best. because many people want to find out what the controversy is about. Hollywood focuses on organized crime because Hollywood is infested by organized crime. Just as in the music industry, you've had this phenomenon known as gangster rap, which has led to this allied phenomena. In ordinary lingo in the United States, gangster has become a verb, an adjective. It does a lot of work. Shirley Graham Du Bois stays on in Ghana, becomes the director of television in Ghana. What she tries to do is install television monitors in villages in Africa, in classrooms, so that television could become a tool for mass education, as opposed to what it has become in the United States, at least, and perhaps elsewhere. That is to say, a tool for misinformation, a tool for mindless entertainment, where it is referred to colloquially as the boob tube. Now, perhaps some of you are wondering, okay, Professor Horn, we hear what you're saying, but here you are, you're sitting in Texas telling us all this. Why are you allowed to do this? Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure if I will be allowed to do this for much longer. But fortunately, I'm able to do so now. And so I will do so until the last breath escapes from my body.